Well, this past week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring was on the FMW promotion and specifically Atsushi Onita. And, I always try to go into these episodes like I'm watching it because I usually know a significant part of the story. Maybe not have heard everybody's firsthand testimony, but whatever the subject is, I have some working knowledge of it. So I try to go in watching it like it's the first time that I've, seen this. So I kind of get an idea of how the average viewer is reacting to it, right? That doesn't have the historical knowledge about wrestling. In this case, I pretty much was seeing a lot of this stuff for the first time because I've seen the clips of the ring blow up with Onita and Terry, obviously, because that, went everywhere at the time on VHS and blah, blah, blah. But I never watched any FMW shows in full, have just seen a few highlights. So some of this shit was, and I had to think again, what do normal people who might wander across that show, or what does even normal wrestling fans from this country that used to watch normal wrestling and maybe watch, Dark Side because they've been attracted to some of the names from the past and they got hooked on the show or whatever. What do they got to be thinking? Because, the one thing I said a week or two ago on whatever show we previewed this, and we were talking to Evan Husney, at least he made money with it, Onita. He was, as far as and I think I asked you this the other day, Brian, so hop right in here again. Remind me, because I'm old and feeble. What did you say? Is this the only garbage match promotion that actually ever made significant money anywhere in the world?
Probably.
One would think.
Because I don't know if IWA ever really made much money, even though they did have the stadium show. Wing, I don't think made any fucking money. ECW, we know about their finances.
Well, no,
the indie stuff today isn't really making much money.
I'm not even going to group ECW. I'm talking about garbage death matches with barbed wire blowing up things on a regular basis, having going just to the extreme. So I don't group Extreme Championship Wrestling in that because even they didn't do that consistently as what did Mick Foley call it, a buffet of violence.
I guess that's what's crazy. In my eyes, as someone who grew up in that era, I almost see ECW and FMW as the class of the garbage style of wrestling. Because everything after them, that's when it really became Outlaw People.
Well, yeah.
Outlaw shows. That's when the Ian Rotten promotion started popping up and just taking things to a stupid level.
Yeah.
And we never really left that point. So I know what you're thinking. You've never seen this stuff before.
Because the emotionally stunted people that are attracted to that kind of thing grew up and actually became garbage match wrestlers, and then it's perpetuated itself. But I say I don't group ECW, even though they had some pretty garbage matches in terms of the barbed wire and the bullshit and everything. They also had Malenko and Guerrero, and they also had et cetera. So honestly, FMW was never known for, I don't think they promoted, nor did probably their audience ever want a classic wrestling match between top talent. The names that Onita used were Terry Funk, who he had befriended Onita when Onita first came to this country and went to Amarillo, and he knew him. And also, here's the thing that wasn't mentioned specifically, but Terry Funk in 1976, through that entire year, was the NWA World Champion that was one of 3 of the highest paid positions in wrestling, along with Andre the Giant and Bruno, right? And that was 1976. You go to 1993 or 94 or whatever it was, 95, that era. Terry got paid as much for that exploding ring match as he made in a month as the NWA champion, wrestling 30 times and crisscrossing the country. So that's one of the, in addition to liking Onita, that's one of the reasons he did it, because they had the whatever Onita was doing, whoever was responsible for it, wherever the backing came from, et cetera, as Onita said, he was making $2 million a year for about 3 years there. And they could pay. And of course, where in those days where Terry went, Cactus Jack went, because they were good friends. And also that was at a point where Cactus was making payoffs for that shit that was bigger than I would assume some. Well, what year? He hadn't got to the WWF yet. He probably never made that much single event money, even in WCW. So, but otherwise than that, they didn't use names. They concentrated on the locals and the guys they could get from America to come and do death matches. Did they ever use any other names?
They used some guys. And again, FMW changed. They showed you when it first popped up at the height of Pride, not Pride, the height of Maeda's UWF in 88. All of a sudden it was Onita versus martial artists, and then it just became all this.
Yeah. But anyway, so I guess for what I'm saying is that the only way that you can excuse it, because it was ridiculous, and it did lead to a lot of the ECW stuff, and also the guys who got into business at that time and looked up to guys like Terry and even Mick at that point, even though he wasn't as big as he'd get yet. You know, they wanted to do that shit, and then it begat, at least, again, Terry and Cactus were still trying to have a wrestling match in the middle of all the mayhem that made it look like that you were having a struggle with your opponent rather than just cooperation on cooperation with throwing each other through furniture and bashing each other with things. But the generations that came afterwards, if they didn't want to become wrestlers, mainstream wrestlers, professional wrestlers, but they thought, I can do this garbage shit because it doesn't hurt. You know, I've damaged my brain doing whatever in my life, so it doesn't hurt me when I do all this stuff. And it led to, as you said, just, you know, what we got since then, which is a bunch of guys in barns bashing each other with shit and taking bumps through light tubes and being airlifted. So I wasn't a fan of the wrestling, but at least you know, the style of wrestling, I should say, but at least you have to acknowledge that Onita for a couple of years there, it was a phenomenon and he made money with it. And then some fan brought up, which wasn't really covered in the Dark Side episode, when they just said Onita decided to give the company to, he couldn't take it anymore. He give the company to the ring announcer. Why is a guy making $2 million a year, a big star like that, unless he knew something nobody else knew, why does he want to just give the company away and get out of the business? Something else was going on there, and I'm sure that one of these days we might find out. But
no mention of the Invader 1 angle where he had him come over to set up a match and then pretended like he was stabbed by the man who murdered Bruiser Brody.
You know, and that would have been a good, then they could have juxtaposed that with footage from the Bruiser Brody episode. But, I mean, when you're going into tasteless things that Onita has done, you can't hit everything. But somebody said, well, and I, as I mentioned last week on the show, I furnished them the footage of the Tupelo concession stand brawl that Onita and Fucci had with Gilbert and Morton, as well as some of their Memphis TV. They used a brief clip of it. And people are saying, well, hardcore wrestling was born in Tennessee. Well, that's not news. We've talked about the original Tupelo concession stand brawl, Lawler and Dundee against Wayne Ferris and Larry Latham, later Honky Tonk Man and Moondog Spot. That this brawl that Onita and Fucci were in was the third go-round. They were redoing that confrontation between Lawler and Dundee and the Blonde Bombers because that actually drew money, as we've mentioned. So it was born with that match, and then they had Gilbert and Morton do a rerun, which actually, this is one of the points. When Lawler and Dundee did it with Ferris and Latham, nobody had seen anything like it. It was Jerry Jarrett's idea to resurrect the territory when Robert Fuller had taken half the guys, gone back to Knoxville, and they were starting fresh with a brand new crew in the space of 3 days' time. And they shot that deal to carry the territory until they could get everybody else in place. And it worked. It tripled the houses around the territory in every town within a couple of weeks. And it was memorable. It was so memorable that they did it again about a year later with the Blonde Bombers and Ricky and Robert Gibson. And that did okay because the Gibson brothers were over already anyway in the territory, and it was a Southern Tag Team title program they were doing anyway, but it didn't set the world on fire because people had just seen it a year and a half before. Then they do it of the following year with Fucci and Onita and Gilbert and Morton, and that was the best one yet. There was more blood. There was more violence. It lasted longer. It was a rougher fight. That's where they didn't even smarten up. Oh, goddamn, the local promoter in Tupelo. What was his name? The local promoter in Tupelo at that time, actually, he leased the building or either owned the building, and he had told him, he said, you can do whatever you want, but don't break my popcorn machine. But they didn't smarten his wife up. And his wife in the video, if anybody sees the uncut video, is the fat woman in the flowery top and the short pants that comes in and slaps Tojo Yamamoto in the middle of the fucking deal because she thinks that they're tearing up her concession stand. Anyway, that didn't do any business. It was the best one. It didn't do any business because the people had seen it. Neither one of those teams were main event guys at the time. They tried to put it on the main event in Memphis the week after that showed because it was such a big, fight. And it didn't do any business because did I mention the people had seen it, and they'd seen it twice before now. And the guys weren't over, so it was just chaos for very little reason, which is what we get today. When everybody has seen something and seen it overdone, it's chaos for no reason, and it doesn't affect business. Somebody asked, I guess this thing has taken on a life of its own because one person thought on Twitter that the Tupelo concession stand brawls, that they actually had the match in the concession stand, that they started out there and that was the point of it. That was what was advertised. And I've done it. No. When you went into Tupelo, the reason why they did these things in Tupelo is because the building was a piece of shit. It was an old, empty building that the kind when you go in the front door, you can build your own walls for dressing rooms. And I think it had been a paint and body shop at one point. And the fans would walk in the front door, and after you passed the ticket table, there was a lunchroom table set up where they sold tickets, and you walked into the building. On the left-hand side was the concession stand, and on the right-hand side were two doors, one for the babyface locker room, one for the heel locker room. Past that, it was just a big open building with chairs on the floor. So the fights in the concession stand came from the heels trying to get away and get back to the locker room, and the babyfaces catching them. And if they fought 5 feet to the left, they'd go in the locker room, but they fought 5 feet to the right, and they got in a concession stand. And that's how they ended up there. But it started as a regular match that got out of hand and then spread around the building, which makes more sense than we're going to have a match in the concession stand. But people would believe you'd do something like that because of today's wrestling. Anyway, so garbage wrestling was invented in Tennessee, but spread by people who didn't understand how it was applied and had just seen one thing that was done over a long period of time and suddenly thought, well, I can make a promotion out of this. And that's what happened. And you get diminishing returns because all it is shock. And you can't sit and watch car wrecks just over and over, just a video of car wrecks with no context for 2 hours. Why? So, I mean, I don't know what else. I knew some of the stories, some I didn't. I hadn't seen all of the footage of everybody blowing up. I knew they nearly melted the Sheik because not only was that a big news story at the time, but also I just read Brian Solomon's book on the Sheik. What else was there that was shocking to you, Brian, as someone who paid more attention to that era in Japan?
What else was more shocking than the moment the Sheik got burned?
Well, I mean, what else was revelatory, or did you might not have known or didn't remember anything, or was it basically just a bunch of people getting blown up?
Yeah, no, I kind of knew everything they covered in the documentary. It didn't touch on new ground. But, it's around the period of time where things kept getting elevated. You remember the big video in 93, probably 92, 93. Remember in Wing, Matsunaga got his head lit on fire?
Yes.
In Hurricane Hall. There was that. There was a guy getting thrown off the balcony. Like one thing after another, after that Sheik Fire match, which I hadn't watched it in a few years. What a disaster. It was really cool to hear Sabu talk about it, quite frankly.
Yeah, that was nice.
Yeah, a nice touch to hear him talk about throwing water on his burning uncle.
Yeah.
But it was just a period of time where FMW started and got success, and then Wing started taking it to at times a gross level, and it got ridiculous.
Well, and Kevin Sullivan was going over for Wing because Victor Quinones from Puerto Rico was involved in that promotion also and sending talent over there. And Victor and Kevin had worked closely, trading talent back and forth, Florida, blah, blah, blah. But that's when Kevin was working for me in Smoky Mountain, and he said, Victor is coming to the States it was Miguel Perez Jr., Crash the Terminator, who later became Hugh Morris, Bill DeMott, but at that time he was just going really mostly wrestling in Japan and overseas. God damn it, somebody else came with him, and then that Kanamura kid.
Yukiro Kanamura, yeah.
Yes, I couldn't remember his first name. It's been 28 years. But Kevin had told me we were doing a thing where Kevin Sullivan, the master of this, squirrely group of nutcases, the Night Stalker and the Mongolian Mauler and the whole 9 yards. He was coming after Brian Lee, and he had debuted by using the golden spike. He pulled a spike out of his fucking robe, and he got juice on Brian Lee with the golden spike, right? And we were building to matches. We even had matches later on that summer where it was a Russian roulette match. Big Boss Man, Bubba, came in, and we had him against Kevin Sullivan, and we put a box on all four corners of the ring. 3 of them were empty. One of them had the spike, and they had to go for the fucking whoever got the spike first could use it. It was fun. Anyway, ways to incorporate spiking people. But Kevin calls me on the phone, and he says, this Kanamura works with Wing. He loves to get juice. If you put him on TV with me, he'll get juice from his arm for the spike. It'll get the spike over. And I was like, juice from the arm, but I knew Sheik had been doing it in Japan. That was a thing that some of them did. I said, all right. So I figured he's going to get a little color from his arm, right? Jesus Christ. Kevin gives him the spike as he's rushing into the corner, spiked his arm, and the kid takes the bump and blades, and he's coming up, and I'm watching the monitor. And at the same time, I'm seeing no blood whatsoever. I look at Brian Hildebrand's face. He's refereeing, and it looks like he's turned green. And what the fuck? And then you see a little trickle of blood. You see him do something else, and then you see some blood. He had cut his arm so deep that it was just meat. It wasn't even bleeding at first, but Brian looked at it, opened up like a goddamn watermelon. And then it was, what the fuck? And it still didn't bleed like the cut deserved. But so we put the X over it when we aired the show, the big red X. You can't see this on broadcast television. But then he had gone so deep and so far. And I would have never in a million years said do that if I'd have known that the guy was going to actually do that to himself. I figured, okay, nobody's gigging him. He's doing it himself, so he knows what he's doing. Then we were in Sevierville, Tennessee at this high school gym. No, I think it was the middle school. And there was like 600 or 800 people there. It was jammed. It was a small gym. They take this guy and take him to the hospital in Sevierville, Tennessee. Here comes 2 Puerto Rican guys, a fucking 300-pound out of DeMott's from New Jersey or whatever, and this Japanese guy in wrestling tights and wrestling boots with his arm wrapped up, covered in blood at the emergency room at Monday night at about 10:30. Well, they're just right down the road from Pigeon Forge there in Sevierville. So they're not used to late night business. And they said when the guys came back and I saw them again, they said, you should have seen the looks on those people's faces. We walked in that hospital room or hospital. But
none of that happens without FMW.
Well, exactly. And I at that time, I had no idea what then I started seeing what they were doing. I was like, oh, shit, no wonder. But I, had assumed that we were still in the wrestling business at that point in time. But anyway, so it was interesting. I mean, there's an audience for this kind of deathmatch garbage shit, and I don't know why. And thankfully, it's not big. And that's what I thought when I first heard about this stuff in the 90s. At least it's in Japan, and you'd never be able to do that over here. And then they brought it over here. And you're right, ECW is very culpable because so many people that watched that and grew up watching that stuff, they knew they couldn't be Guerrero and Malenko, but anybody could be the drunk fucking Sandman or the fucking guy, bashing somebody else with broken light tubes, the Rotten Brothers or whatever. So that's what the majority of people who got into wrestling because of ECW, that's what they wanted to emulate. And then here we go. But this week will certainly be more uplifting because we go from exploding rings to exploding police stations. Bruiser Bedlam, Johnny K9 is this week. And I'm going to be on it, full disclosure, because obviously I kind of suggested this episode to him because I've always wanted to know more about Bruiser's motivations for his double life. And they talked to a lot of people. They talked to his wife. They talked to people that knew him there as well as, people in the wrestling business. So you get these two different pictures of these two different people that he was when he'd go to wrestling. He was a completely different person than when he was administrating the Satan's Choice motorcycle club. But we'll find out this week. He was very friendly to you as a young boy, wasn't he?
Very nice guy. I have a photo of me in Morristown, New Jersey, Morristown, Tennessee. The night of Rob Moore's lawsuit, King of the Mountain tournament. Yeah. And it's me in a shirtless Bruiser Bedlam. He was very nice, although in the photo, the expression he took on was one of shock that he's being photographed. And I am just smiling as bright as possible next to this murderer in this photo. It's pretty funny, actually.
I don't think he was actually allegedly, we got to throw that in, a murderer at that point. It would all.
Oh, you didn't see the main event that night. It murdered Morristown.
Well, I was about to say it killed a few towns, but no, Bruiser. He was a great talent to have work for you because he was so dedicated. He wasn't the smoothest worker in the world, but he was there on time and he was ready to go and he was going to do whatever and he loved it. So we'll see that, but that's this week. It's a double header on Vice because at 9:00 Eastern on Thursday, October 7th, 9:00 is Johnny K9 and Bruiser Bedlam, both of them. They were two different people on Dark Side of the Ring on Vice.